Hello, Miss Hicks's class. Today we're going to finish The Tiger Rising. But first, just so you know, I do not set up meets in the library because you guys are on the computer so much. As it is with your classes, all you have to do is listen to the story. If there is a meet set up, it's set up by someone in your class. And if you are going to set up a meet, do not use the library classroom page to set up a meet that you don't allow everyone in. If you kick people out and don't let them back in, that's not being very nice to them. So the only way I will let you use my Google Classroom to set up a meet with your classmates is if the meet is nice, people are nice to each other, and no one gets kicked out and not allowed back in. Okay, The Tiger Rising, Chapter 26. We left Willie Mae in the motel and went down the highway. "Sistine," he shouted as he ran. "Sistine," he screamed. And miraculously he saw her, her orange dress with pink polka dots, glowing on the horizon. Sistine Bailey. "Hey," he shouted. "Sistine, I've got something to tell you." "I'm not talking to you," she shouted back, but she stopped. She turned around and she put her hands on her hips. He ran faster. "I come to tell you about the tiger," he said when he caught up with her. "What about him?" "I'm fixing to let him go," said Rob. Sistine squinted her eyes at him. "You won't do it," she said. "Yes, I will," he told her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the keys, and held them in front of her proudly, as if he had just conjured them up out of air, as if they had never existed before. "I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it for you." "Woo-wee!" somebody screamed, and Rob turned and saw Bucamp come speeding right towards them in his red Jeep. "Oh no," whispered Rob. "Is it him?" whispered Sistine. Rob nodded. Bucamp pulled over to the side of the road, spraying mud and water everywhere. "You all getting your exercise?" he hollered. Rob shrugged. "Speak up," he roared. He got out of the Jeep and came towards them. Rob quickly pocketed the keys. His heart thumped loudly as if it was cautioning him to keep quiet. Then it went back to beating normally. "Well, looky here," said Bucamp when he saw Sistine. "You're out chasing girls, is that it? Man after my own heart. This your girlfriend?" Bucamp pounded Rob on the back. "No, sir," said Rob. He looked at Sistine. She was staring so hard at Bucamp that Rob was afraid the man might burst into flames. "I got more goods for you. I left 'em back in the motel with Ida Bell." "Yes, sir." "What's your name, little thing?" Bucamp said, turning to Sistine. Rob's heart gave another warning thump. Lord only knew what Sistine would say to Bucamp. But Sistine, as always, surprised him. She smiled sweetly at Bucamp and said, "Sissy." "Well, that's pretty," said Bucamp. "That's the kind of name worth running down the road after." He leaned over to Rob. "Remember what we got going. You're keeping your manly secrets, aren't you?" "Yes, sir," said Rob. Bucamp winked. His toothpick wiggled. "I've got some business in town," he said. He squeezed Rob's shoulder hard and then took his hand away. "You and your girlfriend stay out of trouble now, you hear?" "Yes, sir," said Rob. Bucamp swaggered back to the Jeep, and Rob and Sistine stood together and watched him get in it and roar down the road. "He's afraid," says Sistine. "He's afraid of the tiger. That's why he's making you feed him." Rob nodded. That was another truth he had known without knowing it, the same as he had known that Sistine's father was not coming back. He must, he realized, know somewhere deep inside him more things that he's ever dreamed of. I'm sorry, he said. What I said about your daddy, I'm sorry. I don't want to talk about my father, she said. Maybe he is coming to get you. He's not coming to get me, Sistine tossed her hair. And I don't care. It doesn't matter. What matters is the tiger. Let's go. Let's go set him free. Chapter 27. The first key slid into the first lock so smoothly that it made Rob dizzy with amazement. It was going to be so easy to let the tiger go. Hurry, Sistine said to him. Hurry up. Get the other locks. He opened the second lock and the third, and then he took them off one by one and handed them to Sistine, who laid them on the ground. Now open the door, she said. Rob's heart pounded and fluttered in his chest. What if he eats us? He asked. He won't, said Sistine. He'll leave us alone out of gratitude. Rob flung the door wide. Get out of there, he shouted, and they both jumped back from the door and waited. But the tiger ignored them. He continued to pace back and forth in the cage, oblivious to the open door. Go on, Rob said. You're free, whispered Sistine. But the tiger didn't even look in the direction of the door. Sistine crept forward, grabbed hold of the cage, and shook it. Get out, she screamed. Come on, she said, turning to Rob. Help me. Help me get him out of here. Rob grabbed hold of the fence and shook it. Get, he said. The tiger stopped pacing and turned to stare at them both, clinging like monkeys to the cage. Go on, Rob shouted, suddenly furious. He shook the cage harder. He yelled. He put his head back and howled, and he saw that the sky above them was thick with clouds, and that made him even angrier. He yelled louder. He shouted at the dark sky. He shook the cage as hard as he could. Sistine put a hand on his arm. Sure, shush, she said. He's leaving, watch. As they stared, the tiger stepped with grace and delicacy out of his cage. He put his nose up and sniffed. He took one tiny step, then another. Then he stopped and stood still. Sistine clapped her hands, and the tiger turned and looked back at both of them, his eyes blazing. Then he started to run. He ran so fast, it looked to Rob like he was flying. His muscles moved like a river. It was hard to believe that a cage had ever contained him. It didn't even seem possible. The tiger went leaping through the grass, moving further and further away from Rob and Sistine. He looked like the sun, rising and setting again and again. And watching him go, Rob felt his own heart rising and falling, beating in time. Chapter 28. Oh, said Sistine, in that voice that Rob loved. See, she said, that was the right thing. That was the right thing to do. Rob nodded, but in his mind he saw a flash of green. He remembered what happened to Cricket. What? Said Sistine, turning to them. What are you thinking about? Rob shook his head. Nothing, he told her. Robert! The sound of his name came floating to them from the direction of the motel. That's my dad, he said, confused. That's my dad calling me. And then they heard Willie Mae. Do Jesus, she screamed, her voice high and wide. And then there was a crack of a gun. They both stood still, stunned and silent. And when Willie Mae came running out from under the pine tree and saw them, she stopped. Thank you, Jesus, she said, looking up at the sky. 2 whole children. Thank you. Come here, she said, and she opened her arms. Come to me. Robert started walking towards her. He wanted to tell her she was wrong. He wanted to tell her he didn't feel whole, but he didn't have the energy or the heart to say anything. All he could manage was putting one foot in front of the other. All he could do was keep walking towards Willie Mae. Willie Mae led them back. And when Rob saw the tiger on the ground, his father standing over him holding the rifle, he felt something rise up in him, an anger as big and powerful as the tiger. Bigger. "You killed him," he said to his dad. "I had to," his father said. "That was my tiger," Rob screamed. "You killed him. You killed my tiger." He ran to his father and attacked him. He beat him with his fist. He kicked him, but his father stood like a wall. He held the gun up over his head and kept his eyes open and took each hit without blinking. And Rob saw that hitting wasn't going to be good enough, so he did something he thought he would never do. He opened his suitcase. The words sprung out, coiled and explosive. "I wish it had been you," he screamed. "I wish it had been you that died. I hate you. You aren't the one I need. I need her. I need her." The world and everything in it seemed to stop. He stared at his father. His father stared at him. "Say her name," Rob screamed into the silence. "You say it." "Caroline," his father said, with the gun still over his head, with his eyes still open. And with that world, the small sound of his mother's name, the world lurched back into motion, like an old merry-go-round. It started to spin again. His father put the gun down and pulled Rob to him. "Caroline," his father whispered. "Caroline, Caroline, Caroline." Rob buried his face in his father's shirt. It smelled like sweat and turpentine and green leaves. "I need her," Rob said. "I need her too," said his father, pulling Rob closer. "But we don't got her, neither one of us. What we got, all we got, is each other, and we gotta learn to make do with that." "I ain't gonna cry," Rob said, shutting his eyes, but the tears leaked out of him some anyway. Then they came to a rush, and he couldn't stop. He cried from somewhere deep inside himself, from the place where his mother had been, to the same place that the tiger had been and was gone from now. Rob looked up and saw his father wiping tears from his own eyes. "All right," said his father, holding tight. "That's all right," he said. "You're okay." When Rob finally looked up again, he saw Willie Mae holding Sistine like she was a baby, rocking and saying, "Shh." Willie Mae stared back at him. "Don't think you're going to start pounding on me now," she said. "No, ma'am," said Rob. He wiped the back of his hand across his nose and slid out of his dad's arms. "I went and got your daddy," Willie Mae told Rob, as she swayed back and forth, rocking Sistine. "I figured out what you were going to do. And there ain't no telling what that tiger would have done once he got out of the cage. I went and got your daddy so he could save you." "Yes, ma'am," said Rob. He went and stood over the open-eyed tiger. The bullet hole in his head was small and red. It didn't look big enough to kill him. "Go ahead and touch him," said Sistine. Rob looked up. She was standing beside him. Her dress was twisted and wrinkled. Her eyes were red. Rob stared at her and she nodded. So he knelt and put out a hand and placed it on the tiger's head. He felt the tears rising up in him again. Sistine crouched next to him. She put her hand on the tiger too. "He was so pretty," she said. "He was one of the prettiest things I've ever seen." Rob nodded. "We have to have a funeral for him," Sistine said. "He's a fallen warrior. We have to bury him right." Rob sat down next to the tiger and ran his hand over the rough fur again and again until the tears traveled down his cheeks and dropped onto the ground. Chapter 29. Rob and his father worked with shovels to dig a hole that was deep enough and wide enough and dark enough to hold the tiger. And the whole time it rained. "We got to say some words over him," said Willie Mae, when the hole was done and the tiger was in. "Can't cover up nothing without saying some words." "I'll say the poem," said Sistine. She folded her hands in front of her and looked at the ground. "Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night," she recited. Rob closed his eyes. "What immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? In the distant, deeper skies burnt the fire in thine eyes. Oh, what wings dare he inspire?" To Rob it sounded like music, but better. His eyes filled up with tears again. He worried that now that he had started crying, he might never stop. "That's all I remember," Sistine said after a minute. "There's more to it, but I can't remember it all." "You say something, Rob," she said. "I don't have nothing to say," said Rob, "except for I loved him." "Well," said Willie Mae, "what I got to say, I ain't had good experience with animals in cages." She reached into her pocket, took out the wooden bird, bent and laid it on top of the tiger. "That ain't nothing," she said to the tiger, "just a little bird to keep you company." She stepped back and away from the grave. Rob's father cleared his throat. He hummed softly, and Rob thought he was going to sing, but instead he shook his head and said, "I had to shoot him. I'm sorry, but I had to shoot him. For Rob." Rob leaned into his father, and it felt, for a minute, like his father leaned back. Then Rob picked up his shovel and started covering the tiger with dirt. As he filled the grave, something danced and flickered on his arm. Rob stared at it, wondering what it was. Then he recognized it. It was his son, showing up in time for another funeral. "I'm sorry I made you do it," Sistine said to Rob when he was done. "He wouldn't be dead if I hadn't made you do it." "It's all right," Rob said. "I ain't worried about what I did." "We can make a headstone for him," said Sistine, "and we can bring flowers and put them on his grave. Fresh ones every day." She slipped her hand into his. "I didn't mean what I said before, about you being a sissy. And I don't hate you. You're my best friend." The whole way back to Kentucky Star, Rob held on to Sistine's hand. He marveled at what a small hand it was, and how much comfort there was in holding on to it. And he marveled, too, at how different he felt inside, how much lighter, as if he had set something heavy down and walked away from it without bothering to look back. Chapter 30. That night his father sang to Rob as he put the medicine on his legs. He sang the song about mining for gold, the one that he used to sing with Rob's mother. When he was done with the medicine and the song, he cleared his throat and said, "Caroline loved that song." "Me too," said Rob. "I like it too." His father stood up. "You're going to have to tell Bucamp what you did was the thing that let that tiger go." "Yes, sir. I'll tell him I was the one who shot him, but you got to admit to letting him go." "Yes, sir," said Rob. "I might could lose my job over it," his father said. "I know," said Rob. He wasn't afraid. He thought about Bucamp shaking hands. Bucamp was a coward. He knew that now. "I thought I would tell him I could work for him to pay for what I done." "You can offer him up some reasonable kind of solution," his father said, "but it don't mean he'll go for it. There ain't no predicting Bucamp, other than to say he's going to be mad." Rob nodded. "And on Monday," his father continued, "I aim to call the principal and tell him you're going back to school. I ain't messing around with taking you to more doctors. You're going back, and that's that." "Yes, sir," said Rob. He didn't mind the thought of going back to school. School was where Sistine would be. His father cleared his throat. "It's hard for me to talk about your mama. I would never have believed that I could miss somebody the way I miss her. Saying her name pains me." He bent his head and concentrated on putting the cap on the tube of medicine. "But I'll say it for you, and I'll try on account of you." Rob looked at his father's hands. They were hands that held the gun and shot the tiger. They were the hands that put the medicine on his legs. They were the hands that held him high when he cried. They were complicated hands, Rob thought. "You want some macaroni and cheese for dinner?" his father asked, looking back up at Rob. "That sounds all right," said Rob. "Macaroni and cheese sounds real good." That night, Rob dreamed he and Sistine were standing at the grave of the tiger. They were watching and waiting. He didn't know what for, but then he saw a flutter of green wings and he understood. It was the wooden bird, only he wasn't made of wood, he was real. He flew up out of the tiger's grave, and they chased him, laughing and bumping into each other. They tried to catch him, but they couldn't. The bird flew higher and higher until it disappeared in the sky. It looked just like the Sistine's chapel. In his dream, Rod stood and stared up at the sky, admiring all the figures and colors, watching as the bird disappeared into them. "See," said Sistine in his dream, "I told you it was like fireworks." He woke up smiling, staring at the ceiling of the motel room. "Guess what?" his father called to him from outside. "What?" said Rob. "There ain't a cloud in the sky," said his father. "That's what." Rob nodded. He laid in his bed and watched the sun poke his way through the curtain. He thought about Sistine and the tiger he wanted to make for her. He thought about what kind of wood he would use and how big he would make the tiger. He thought about how happy Sistine would be when he saw it. He lay in bed and considered the future, and outside his window, the tiny neon Kentucky star rose and fell, and rose and fell, competing bravely with the light of the morning sun. The end.